So, in his argument to defend Christianity from Nietzsche's onslaught, aside from wondering how fair Nietzsche is and whether maybe what Nietzsche's doing is correctly pointing out degenerate forms of Christianity or Christian practice or Christian psychology without acknowledging that these are degenerate forms and that there might be a respectable or a virtuous version of whatever it is that he's pointing at. So John's example is, there are degenerate forms of love, right? There's controlling relationships, and there's stalking, and there's kind of self-abasing, where somebody is, so completely dependent on their romantic other that actually the thing becomes unhealthy. There's codependency, right, which is where somebody might be an alcoholic, and they have a life partner who actually comes to need that person's alcoholism in order to feel needed and to have a role in life themselves. So whilst the alcoholic's partner outwardly seems to support the alcoholic's attempts to get well, all the while they're sort of subconsciously undermining it because they're afraid that if their partner recovered from their alcoholism, they would be themselves left without a role. That's codependency. So there are lots of unhealthy forms of love. Nevertheless, love doesn't have to be like that. Love can be lovely. Love can be good. Love can be good for you, and can be good for both of you. So you don't make the case against romantic or erotic love just by pointing out to all the cases where it goes wrong, right? Part of John's thought about Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is very good at pointing to all the places where religion goes wrong, but maybe he's failing to acknowledge the spots where it goes right, where it's true to itself, where it's true to its own ideals. There's nothing about love in Nietzsche's account of Christianity, which is interesting to say the least. It's not the way that Christians would describe Christianity. Christians often describe Christianity as the religion of love, which is maybe a bit hard on other religions that think they have love at the centre. But anyway, that marks the difference between the way Christians understand Christianity and the way Nietzsche understands Christianity. Now, there's a move that John makes that I want to mention, and that is the forms of life move. Distinct forms of life have their own grammar. So this is something from Wittgenstein. Whenever we talk about forms of life in philosophy, forms of life and language games, we are appealing to the later Wittgenstein. And the idea is this, that linguistic expressions mean what they mean because they're embedded in distinct practices, distinct activities. And if you try to read across from one to another, you will misunderstand what's going on, and you may criticize a practice or a form of life by misreading it, misreading its utterances, because you're assuming that they work the same way as similar sounding words in other practices. And in particular, there is the whole business of forming, testing, announcing, asserting, doubting, having faith in, putting one's trust in propositions. That's something we do in science. It's also something you do in religion. But the argument goes, and there are Wittgensteinian philosophers of religion, Wittgensteinian theologians who expand this. D.Z. Phillips, for one, for example. Here's an analogy, right? Let's suppose that Brentford, the lower league association football club, is having a particularly good cup run. They're doing well in the FA Cup. They've been drawn against a team from a higher league, and they're beating them. The deliriously happy Brentford fans sing in unison that Brentford are the greatest team the world has ever seen. Now, are they idiots? After all, the proposition that Brentford is the greatest team the world has ever seen is, on the face of it, an empirical proposition, and it's testable, and what's more, it's false. The Brazil side of 1970, or the AC Milan side of the 1990s, not to mention Liverpool sides past and present, many of them, would easily beat Brentford. They'd easily beat Brentford, and are far more likely contenders for the title of the greatest team the world has ever seen. So the Brentford supporters are wrong, and what's more, they're irrational, because they're failing to take into account the evidence. They're asserting this proposition that Brentford is the finest team the world has ever seen, and it's testable. They could test it if they wanted to, but they choose not to. Why? Because they are just, pig-headedly irrational. So I'm kind of doing a Dawkins on them there, right? This is the kind of new atheist line on Brentford supporters. The Wittgensteinian defence of the Brentford supporters would go something like this. Look, you've got to be reading them wrong, because many of these Brentford football supporters are, educated football fans. They watch other football. They watch international football. They know that any Premiership side, not to mention the Brazil side of 1970, would make mincemeat of Brentford. They're not fools. They're not stupid. So if they seem to be singing something, if they seem to be asserting a proposition that makes them look stupid, well, we must be reading them wrong. So what's going on? Well, singing that Brentford are the finest team the world has ever seen in that context, on that occasion, is something you do. And it expresses delirious happiness and community spirit, togetherness. It's part of the ritual. It's it's a way of it's a kind of flamboyant assertion of bragging rights, because it kind of goads the opponents. Like supposing they're beating, I don't know, Norwich, and the Norwich supporters might be tempted to say, well, come on, don't be stupid, Brentford aren't the best team ever, which would obviously bring the reply, yeah, neither are Norwich, right? So it has a role in the life of football fans that you will completely miss if you just think of it as the assertion of an empirical proposition. It's doing something else. So if you go all new atheist on the Brentford fans singing that Brentford are the finest team the world has ever seen, you just miss the point. And you've misunderstood the activity, you've misunderstood the form of life that is following lower league football. So the Wittgensteinian line is that this move is always open, that whenever you come across some activity, some linguistic carry-on which seems mysterious, the mystery almost certainly arises from your failure to get to understand, to get to know your way round the form of life that expression is part of. So this is essentially the move that John Lippitt wants to make on behalf of religion generally, and Christianity in particular, against Nietzsche. But what Nietzsche's doing is sliding together some quite distinct forms of discourse. You've got psychology, you've got ethics, and you've got religion. And Nietzsche kind of slides from one to the other. And it's important to see that religion is often a category on its own. And if you try and understand it as kind of ethics with stories, or if you try and understand it as kind of metaphysics with hymns, or something like that, or as law only with pointy hats instead of wigs, you'll misunderstand it. It's something else. One way to get a kind of practical grip on this is there is a rabbi who goes round checking food processing plants. Because as you know, in Orthodox Judaism, it's important that the commandment is not to seethe the kid in its mother's milk. And this is understood in Orthodox Judaism to mean that you shouldn't mix milk and meat. And exactly what not mixing milk and meat means depends on exactly which community you belong to, but there's a rigorous version where even so take a step back. There's a distinction between plants and animals that goes all the way down to microbial level, right? I mean, once we're down to microbes, the distinction between plants and animals is really, I think, something just to do with the thickness of the cell wall. Nevertheless, biologists do distinguish between microbial plants and microbial animals. Now, if you cook a microbial animal, what you get is microbial meat, and this must not be mixed with milk. Now, microbes are used in all sorts of food processing procedures, and they don't appear on the ingredients, right? So you might add some microbes to a vat of whatever it is you're making, and they will, there'll be some kind of enzymic reaction, and then they get sieved out, and they don't appear on the ingredients list, but nevertheless they're part of the process. So if the microbes that you use in your food processing are strictly speaking animals, and if that food processing also involves milk, or if it produces food that might be mixed with milk in cooking, that's a problem for Jewish law if we're very strict. So this rabbi goes round checking, visiting factories, checking on their microbial processes, just to make sure that there are no animal microbes being used in the production of foodstuffs which might later be mixed with meat. Right, here comes the point you may have been wondering. Here it comes. Somebody asked him, this doesn't make any earthly... Why are you doing this? This doesn't make any earthly sense. And his answer was, precisely. It's the bits that don't make any earthly sense that are properly religious. If you need religion to tell you to look after the little guy and not to tell lies and not to murder people and to respect your parents, if you need religion to tell you that, then you're some kind of dysfunctional human being. That's not really the religious part. The really religious part is the commandments that say you mustn't mix meat with milk, or you mustn't carry keys on a Saturday, or you have to wear certain kinds of hat. The stuff that makes no practical sense in human terms, but is nevertheless a commandment from God. That's the stuff is really religious, and you obey it just because you've been commanded to do it, right? Now, that's not the only way of viewing religious commandments, and the idea that religious commandments should have no connection with human flourishing is not universal amongst theologians. Nevertheless, you get the point is that there's a kind of extreme example where religion is doing its own thing, and if you try and evaluate it in terms of other language games, other practices, other forms of life, you're just going to miss the point. So if you look at this rabbi and say, well, he's not really adding anything to our understanding of food hygiene. In fact, he's, he wears a hairnet when he goes around these factories, but still it would be better for the hygiene if he stayed out the factory altogether. You're missing the point, right? So that's a kind of crude but vivid version of the Wittgensteinian idea that if you criticise a form of life or a practice by bringing forms of criticism or criteria from other practices to bear, then you're just missing the point. And what you need to do is rather spend time immersing yourself in that practice so you get it from the inside, so you see it, understand it as practitioners do. That way you'll be able to see that just bringing in criteria from elsewhere just misses the point.